With the help of Hashem, we are learning Chagiga Daf Chaf Dalid. In today's Daf, we're going to conclude the unpacking of the Mishnah and of the 11 Milas Chumras that we have on Kodesh over Truma. The Mishnah that we had on Daf Chaf Amid Beis. We're going to begin today from Daf Chaf Gimel Amid Beis. We are up to 10 lines before the bottom of the Amid. We are going to go through rule number 7. Rule number 7 is that the Keli is mitzadef. The Keli combines everything that's in it only regarding to Kodesh. We're going to add many nuances that we did not speak out when we learned this in the Mishnah. We're going to learn the rule. We're going to see whether this rule number 7 is midrabanan, as are almost all of the rules in the Mishnah, or whether rule number 7 is a din do'iraisa, that a keli is mitzdarif, everything that's inside of it. We're going to move on to the 8th rule in the Mishnah that says that by Kodesh, Tuma can go down even up until a Revi'i. We're going to see how we know that from. We will actually see that Shlishi, Bakachim, is a din do'iraisa. We're going to have a Kal V'chomer from Truma, from where we're going to say that since Truma goes until Shlishi, a Revi'i goes even until a Revi'i. We're going to speak out the general rule of Dayoy, and that is that when you make a Kal V'chomer, the Chomer cannot be more than the Kal, even though it's learned from the Kal. We say it's sufficient for the student, so to say, to be like the teacher. However, we're going to learn today the exception that if using dayoy, as we'll explain when we learn the daf, we're going to completely nullify the kal v'chomer, then we do go beyond. We don't say sufficient, which will be a great example over here, that shlishi is tamei up until the level, Truma is tamei up until the level of shlishi, and kodesh goes even a step further because of the kal v'chomer. We're going to learn regarding the 9th rule in the Mishnah, that when it comes to Tumas Yodayim vis-a-vis Truma, if only one hand touched, let's say, something that's a Rishon, and Midrabanan, the one hand becomes a Sheni, it's only that one hand. By Kachim, we say that when one hand becomes Tamei, it could affect the second hand. Parenthetically, we learned in Daf Yud Ches Amid Beis that when it comes to Kachim, when the hands are tummy on the level of a Sheni, Netilas Yodayim is not enough. You have to do Tfilas Yodayim. But that Bechlal won't be the focus today of how do we get rid of the Tumah. We're just speaking about if the hands are tummy or not. So in the Mishnah, again, we went through the Mishnah quickly. It sounds like when one hand becomes tummy, automatically the other hand becomes tamei. That's for sure not the 9th rule of the Mishnah. We're going to learn ultimately 3 dinim concerning this 9th rule. We're going to learn the 10th rule of the Mishnah. We're going to speak out the rule that when it comes to kachim never need to become wet for it to become mukhshar like habal tuma. There's a concept called chibas hakodesh machsharton, simply by the fact that it's kachim, it's that chashiv, it's so chashiv that when the product is finished, even if it's a food product. And again, the rule normally is that anything that grows after it's cut off the ground, after it's harvested, it first needs to become wet, not stam wet, but it has to become wet with the consent of its owner for it then to become susceptible to becoming tamei. By kachim, we don't need such a step to happen. It's automatically readied and susceptible to becoming tamei, and the Gemara is going to make it clear that the 10th rule that we will review is not connected to the chibas hakodesh machsharton, as we'll explain. And finally, we're going to go on the 11th rule of the Mishnah, that an oinen and a mechusar kippurim, after they leave that state of aninus, or after they are already ready, after they brought their korban, they require midrabanan another tevila, another immersion. And that's something that's only said by Kodesh and not by Truma. Chavra, what can I say? Ashreinu. Today's daf will be again a jam-packed, filled daf with many, many dinim connected to the dinim of Tuma and Tara. Again, we are up to Daf Chav Gimel Amid Beis. We left off 10 lines before the bottom of the Amid. In the beginning of the line, we are referring back to the 7th Maila, or to the 7th stringency, higher standard that we have by Kachim, even over Truma, and that is, let's read it inside, that Hakeli mitzadef or mitzadef masha b'toicha l'kodesh. Now, let me explain like this. When you have a source of Tuma, and it has halachic contact with something else, that something else becomes tamei. Normally, like we said, on the notch lower. What happens if I have a keli and it's filled with meat? You have a bowl and it's filled with meat. But let's go even more. I want to add something that we didn't speak out when we learned the Mishnah. What happens if the pieces of meat are b'chlal not touching each other? The source of tumah, right, we're not speaking about a earthenware utensil, that if the source of tumah goes in its ear space, it makes the keli tamei, then the keli is touching everything in it. No, it's a metal utensil. There has to be actual contact. The source of tumah touched one piece of meat, did not touch the keli. So let's go through the steps. Let's say that the source of tumah is an av, and it touched one piece of meat, which now becomes a rishon. Don't forget, chevra, that mido oiraisa, a keli b'chlal does not become tamei. And by the way, even midrabanan, in the case that I mentioned, where there's no liquid involved, the keli is not tamei at all. So you have a piece of meat that's a rishon. What would happen? Normally, nothing. The keli cannot become a sheni. This piece of meat is not touching another piece of meat. So nothing else other than the one that had actual contact with tumah becomes tamei. And that's not only true by chulin, that's even true by truma. But that's the Mishnah. When it comes to kachim, we say that all of the other pieces of meat that are in the same utensil, they are all considered as if they had contact with the source of tumah. So source tumah, let's say, is an av, is a dead sheretz. It touched meat number one. It's as if the sheretz touched directly all of the pieces of meat. All of the pieces of meat become tamei midrabanan on a level of a rishon as far as kachim is concerned. That's the meaning, that the keli combines everything that's in it. So says the Gemara, truma. But we don't say that, not even regarding truma and avada, not for ma'aser sheni, and certainly not concerning chulin. Baruch atah Adino Eloheinu melech haolam shachar kol nehim b'dvarim. Says the Gemara, what makes this seventh chomer unique is that this is a din de oiraisa. Mino hanamili. How do we know that? Amar Rab Chanan, at least according to Rab Chanan, he's quoting a pasuk that we have in the portion of Nasi regarding the inauguration of the Mishkan and the Nisim, amongst many other things. The Amar Kra Kaf Achas, they brought one ladle, Asara Zahav, right? This is the weight of the ladle, and it was filled with ketoides. So as the Rabbeinu Hananel points out, that kaf, ladle, in the singular means one. So the word achas is superfluous. The Torah could have written kaf, asara zahav melei ketoides. Why did the Torah add the word achas? Hakosuv asoi lechol mashe bekaf achas. The Torah considers everything. That means all of the granules, the shtikalach of ketoides that are in the ladle, they are all considered one. And chevra, here's the key. It's not only that they are considered one, because b'poil, when you have something that's finely ground up, like the incense, all of the little pieces are touching each other. We don't say that, we say something much more than that. That if you have one keli, something that has a receptacle, not something that's flat, something that has at least a little bit of a indentation, everything that's in it is considered as if it's touching each other, and more than that, it's considered as if it's one. So if the av hatuma, like we said, touches one piece of meat that's inside this plate, it's as if the av hatuma touched directly all of the other pieces of meat. And again, the pshat of Rab Chanan is, it's a biblical halacha. Says the Gemara Masiv Rav Kahana against Rab Chanan, quoting a Mishnah Masechta Seiduyos, that Hoisiv Rab Akiva added to what? So Rashi gives us the background. Look inside the Rashi, 7 lines before the bottom of the Amid. Reisha Katani, the beginning of that Mishnah speaks about the testimony given by the Tana Reb Shimon regarding ashes of the chatos, of the burnt red heifer. That if some tumah touched part of it, it's as if it touched all of it. Now, the din of the efer chatos has nothing to do with the efer chatos being in a utensil. It's simply that by the fact, and that this we spoke about when we learned the Mishnah, When you have two pieces of meat, forget about them being in the same utensil. Forget about, even by kachim, two pieces of meat. If the source of tumah touches one, so that one becomes, let's say, a rishon. So any other piece of meat that's touching that one becomes a sheni. Any other piece of meat that's touching the other one becomes a shlishi. How do you view ketoides? You can say that it's finely ground up, it's a granule, Danny's trying to say. It's a little shtickle or something like that.
I was saying shtikalach.
Little shtikalach. Okay, I'll stick with the Yiddish. So do you view every shtikala as a separate entity? If that would be the case, then if the source of tumah touches one shtikala, then that one becomes on that level. The one surrounding it goes down a level, and before you go far away, there's no tumah anymore. We don't say that. We consider all of these shtikalach, since they are physically together, as if it's like one piece of meat. And on that, added Rabbi Akiva, that hasoiles, fine flour. Haketoides is incense, right, which is similar to the ashes of the chatas. Levoina, the frankincense. Hagacholim, a whole discussion in the Rishonim, what coals are we talking about? Well, let's move on. She'im nagat ful yoim b'miktsasai. Pasal eskuloi. This is part of his testimony. It's as if they touched all of it. Now, why does he say that? Look inside Rashi, 3 lines before the bottom of the Amid. That's important. He added all of these cases based on the rule shakli mitztorfen yachad. So hold on, now we got a problem. The problem is that all of the Mishnah, the eduyos that are spoken out over there in the Mishnah that we just quoted, has to be rabbinic laws. Why must it be rabbinic laws? Because Rabbi Akiva is adding to Rab Shimon. Now listen to this, Chevron. The pasuk that Rab Chanan quoted was a pasuk regarding Ktoides, not a pasuk regarding the Efer Chatos. So since Rabbi Akiva is extending the din of Rab Shimon, the din of Rab Shimon has no source, because the din of Rab Shimon is regarding the ashes of the red heifer. It must be the din of Rab Shimon is a din de Rabbanan. It must be, it's a din de Rabbanan. There's no source for that. Rabbi Akiva, who's adding, and the way we are understanding his addition, it is connected to the rule that since they are all together in one utensil, that's why they're considered one. All of that must be a din de Rabbanan. Let's read it inside. It must be a de Rabbanan. The Gemara explains, Mimai, how do I know that this Rabbi Akiva's hoisafa is a de Rabbanan? Because since it says in the Reisha, like we just learned in Rashi, that hey, the Rab Shimon, now at least we know that Rab Shimon is ben Beseira. I want to tell you, whenever you read the Rab Shimon Stam, it means Rab Shimon Bar Yochai. But here we have, since Rab Shimon ben Beseira says regarding Al Efer Chata Shenoga Hatomim b'Miktsas Yishitim Eskuloi, and on that it says Hoisev Rabbi Akiva, and like we mentioned, the din regarding Efer Chatos cannot be based on a biblical pasuk, because the pasuk of Rab Chanan is regarding the Ktoides, not regarding the Efer Chatos. And now we see that Rabbi Akiva, the way it's formulated over there, Mishnah Yisuduyos, he was extending a din that our Gemara understands this din to be the din of our Mishnah, to be the din that Keli it's mitzdarefit. Not just because it's granules, it's shtikalach, it's considered one. No, the way we are understanding Rabbi Akiva, the Gemara says it's because of Keli is mitzdaref. Hold on, so that's a din de Rabbanan. So Amar Reish Lakish Mishum Karparam Daf Chav Dalid Loi. No. That if it comes to the din of Ketoides, let's say, then it's a din d'oraisa. When did we need the testimony of Rabbi Akiva, which is extending a rabbinic halacha? It's only regarding the shiyarei mincha. Now, really, Rabbi Akiva spoke about soilis, Ketoides, levoina, kecholim. We're going to get that. We're going to get back to all of them. But the first one that he mentioned was fine flour. Now, the fine flour that are considered one unit because they are inside a keli, which is what Rabbi Akiva is saying, is concerning flour after already the kemitza was removed from it. And why is that important? Because you have certain items that must be inside what we call a klei shadis. There are certain items that no longer need to be inside a klei shadis. Logic is, this is all that Reish Lakish defending Rab Chanan, that when would the Torah say that since items are in a utensil, they are considered one unit, that's only if they must be in that utensil. Now, normally for something to go on the altar, even though prior it already had a certain level of kedusha, but for you to imbue additional kedusha for it to be right to go on the mizbeach, you have to put it in the kalei shadas. And that's taka the case when it comes to flour offerings. They have to be put in the kalei shadas. But all of that is prior to you doing the service, which is the kemitza and then the heilacha, right? Well, actually, kemitza, putting it in a new kalei shadas, which is similar to the Kabbalah, the heilacha, and then the burning it on the altar. After you did the kemitza, the avodah with the kemitza, the shirayim, which are going to be given to the kaihanim, they don't have to be in a kalei shadas. So says the Gemara, de oiraisa, right? That which, when do we have the source, de oiraisa? And again, we are understanding, I'll have to go back, it's not just because they are shtikalach, but because they are shtikalach in a keli, that's why they're considered combined. And therefore, it's not even if they're little, and it's not even if they're touching. That is, since they need a keli, that's when we say biblically that akli mitzarfai. Because she'ein tzarach lekeli, items that no longer need to be put in a service utensil in a klei shadas, which would be the case of the soilus after the kemitza was removed, which is the case of Rabbi Akiva, ein kli mitzarfai. Then the keli midda oiraisa no longer combines it. And now we have asur abanan and vegazru, the aflagav, the ein tzarech lekli, still claim mitzarfai, so it fits. And that's the Mishnah of Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara tells Reish Lakish, well, good, but not good enough, because you only explained the case of Soilus. Tinach Soilus, Ktoides is in a Klei prior to it being put on the inner altar. Ktoides is in a kaf prior to the Kohen Gadol bringing it into the Holy of Holies. That's it. It's never in a ladle or in a keli if it no longer needs to go on the altar. And Rabbi Akiva also spoke about the din, how if something touches one piece of the ketaitis that's in the ladle, then all of it is considered as if it had direct contact. Ketaitis and the levaina also. The levaina ultimately is going to be put on the mizbeach. After the levaina is put on the altar, there's no leftover levaina. So the levaina is prior to be putting it on the altar, it has to be in a klei shadas. So ma'ika l'meimar. So Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua, I can still explain how the Mishnah and Leiduyos, which is a din midrabanan, doesn't contradict Rab Chanan's source for our seventh chumrah, making it a biblical one, that the case in Eduyos kegoin shetzavran al gab kartavla, that maybe he had put all of these items that are mentioned, whether it is the soilus, which works no matter what, the ketaitas, the levaina, the gechalim, they put it on some sort of leather spread, or something that's flat, something that halachically is not considered a receptacle because there is no indentation inside of it. The oiraisa, like Rab Chanan, only yesh loy toich, only something that has a receptacle, like the ladle that was used for the ketaitas is mitzaref on a biblical level, but ein loy toich on a biblical level einoy mitzaref. And now, v'asar abanan v'tiknu the afagav the ein l'toich mitzaref. So therefore, Reish Lakish succeeded in defending Rab Chanan, even though the Mishnah and Eduyos is speaking about a scenario midrabanan. Now, says the Gemara, okay, fine, we did not refute Rab Chanan, but not everyone agrees with him. Uplige the Rab Chanan ad Rab Chia bar Abba. In other words, he is holding that Siruf is Doiraisa, Rab Chia bar Abba holds it's not. Amar Rab Chia bar Abba, Amar Rab Yechanan, me'edusai shel Rab Akiva nishnesh mishnazu, that our Mishnah is completely based on the testimony of Rabbi Akiva. Again, no one is debating that in Eduyos, since Rabbi Akiva is adding to Rab Shimon ben Beseira, who began introducing the concept of keli mitzaref. Okay, again, not because it's granules, but it's not because it's shtikalach, but because it's inside a keli. Regarding the Efer Chatos has no biblical source. He does make a link between our Mishnah and that Mishnah. In other words, he holds that there is a consistency in our Mishnah, that everything mentioned in our Mishnah is only a rabbinic law, including this law that keli mitzaref. But guys, don't forget, keli mitzaref only for Kodesh. For Truma, Ma'aser Sheni, and Chulin, it's not. Okay, moving on to the eighth. Now the eighth Maila that we learned in our Mishnah is probably from the 11, the most known Because whenever we introduce and whenever we review the laws of Tum and Tara, we always go through, we had this again in Psachim, in Abchanin Esgana Kehanim, all of the steps that Chulin, Adam and Kalim can only become a Rishon, biblically. Oichlin and Mashkin can even become a Sheni, but that's the end of the line. Truma can become a Shlishi, Revi can become a Kodesh, Efer Chatas can become a fifth. We always review that. So Haravi, Ba Kodesh is puzzle. Again, with the nuance, we don't say Haravi Ba Kodesh Tameh, because since Revi by Kachim is the end of the line, whatever is Tameh at the end of the line is called puzzle and not Tameh, in that detail. Tanya says the Gemara we learned in the Braisa. Amar Rabbi Yosi, Minayin lo Revi Ba Kodesh Hu puzzle. From where do we get this from? So the Gemara answers Rabbi Yosi and the Braisa, we know this from a Kal V'chomer. V'dinu. What's the Kal V'chomer? Uma mechuser kippurim. Someone, the people who not only have to go through various steps of Tahara, but even after they go through all these steps, may not eat kachim prior to them bringing their karbanos. They are called the people that are still lacking in atonement. And the rule is that once they underwent all of the steps of Tahara, which by the way will also include head of Shemesh, they are already allowed to eat Truma. Right? The first Mishnah in Brachas. Kohanim eat Truma from Tzeisak Echavim. Even Kohanim that still have to bring a karban the following day. But the rule is, why do you have to bring the karbanos? What will those kapara karbanos achieve, aside of fulfilling the mitzvah? You are puzzled to eat kodesh. That's the rule. Someone who went through all the steps, it's already the night going into the 8th, they can eat Truma, but they can only eat kachim until they bring the karban. From here you see that kachim is viewed and dealt with more stringently. Now, shlishi shepasul betruma, truma could become and becomes tamei even on a level of a shlishi, which is one step more than chulin. And Rashi, 11 lines on top of the Amid, quotes the Gemara in Soita, which he just chazers over the source for that. They're not going to go into the Rashi right now. But it's interesting to note that the source that Truma becomes even in Tamei or Puzzle on the level of a Shlishi is from a Kal V'chomer. So I'm saying it's interesting because we are now making a Kal V'chomer on top of a Kal V'chomer. No, it's Shlishi becomes Tamei on the level of Puzzle. The end of the line, even Shlishi. That's Truma. Truma becomes Puzzle on the level of a Shlishi. Kodesh is more Chamur than Truma. How do I know that? Because of Mechusar Kippurim. Could eat Truma, cannot eat Kachim. So now it's logical to say that if Truma can become Tamei on the level of a Shlishi, Kachim, which is more Chamor, can become Tamei even on a level further. So Einodin Sheyaseh Revi Ela Kodesh. Now, let me add a very important nuance. We have the Kal V'chomer makes sense. Kachim is more Chamor than Truma. That's called the Kal V'chomer. But let me tell you the following. There is something called dayoy. We have to remember this. That's daled yud vav. The word dayoy means sufficient. Dayoy means that when you make a Kal V'chomer, the premise of a Kal V'chomer is that you know something regarding A. We don't know something regarding B. But we say logically, if we know from other laws that B is considered more chamur than A, so logically, if that applies to A, it applies to B. We can never add a law in B that you don't have in A. In other words, the student cannot have something that the teacher didn't have. We say sufficient. It's logical that B should be like A, even though really B is more chamur than A, but that's the way a Kal V'chomer works. A is more kal, B is more chamur. Laws that are written explicitly by A, or we know by A, will be applied to B, but we can't go beyond that which is by A. That's called sufficient. It's sufficient for the chamur, or for the student, to be like the teacher, can be more, even though it's more chamur. Now, we are not saying dayoy over here, because Truma is the teacher, Kachim is the student. Truma, as we quoted from Soita, we know that Truma becomes Tamei even up until Shlishi, but Truma never becomes a Revi. We are saying that Kodesh becomes even a Revi. Why? Because we have a Kal V'chomer. Okay, I get there's a Kal V'chomer. So that should be enough to say that Kodesh becomes a Shlishi. Here we're saying no. Here we're saying that Kodesh becomes a Revi. How can we do that? So that's why Rabbi Yosi adds the words. I'll tell you why. If we would not have even known by Kachim that there was a Shlishi, even that we would have not known, the Kal V'chomer would have been used to teach you that since we find in the Masechta Soita that Truma becomes a Shlishi, Kachim for sure becomes a Shlishi, because, Mechusei Kippurim, etc. But we already know that Kachim is a Shlishi. V'lomadnu Shlishi LaKodesh. We know from elsewhere, as the Gemara will quote in a few lines, that Kodesh becomes Tamei on the level of a Shlishi. And we know that Min HaTorah. This is important. So now let me tell you something. If using the rule of Dayoy, you nullify the Kal V'chomer, then you don't do Dayoy, you say the Kal V'chomer. Since you already know Shlishi BaKodesh, so the Kal V'chomer, if you were to use it, can only be used to add something that you don't yet know. What don't you yet know, Revi? So that's why Revi B'Kal V'chomer. Now you get out these words. Had we not even known Shlishi BaKodesh, I would have learned Shlishi BaKodesh from Truma by the Kal V'chomer, but I would not make Kodesh even more than Truma. Dayoy. Here you can't say Dayoy. If you're going to say Dayoy, you have no Kal V'chomer, because I know Shlishi BaKodesh Min HaTorah. Now the Gemara says, okay, Shlishi LaKodesh Min HaTorah, it's that important. Now, how do you know that Minayin? So the Gemara says, because we have a pasuk in Parshas Tzav. The pasuk says like this, that V'habasar Chagiga b'chol tamei, that meat, the sacrificial meat, that touches anything that's tamei, lo yei achel. Now, we find elsewhere in the Torah, by Chulin, that food could become a sheni, which is what we keep on saying. That biblically, oichlin and mashkin, even Chulin can become tamei. So when the Torah says that if sacrificial meat touches anything that's tamei, the sacrificial meat became tamei, which is why you can't eat it. Now, Milo Yaskinan is the pasuk not also talking about that the tamei is basheni. And how do we know that from Rashi tells us? Because in Parsha Shemini, when the Torah is speaking about this whole idea that an earthenware utensil, anything that's inside of it, becomes tamei if tuma goes into it, and the Torah is speaking about scenarios where you have a dead sheretz, which is an av, it went in the airspace of a keli. What happens to the keli? The keli becomes a rishon. Keli can become a rishon, like an adam biblically. And the Torah says that all the food in the keli is also tamei. Now, the food will be a sheni. Sheretz Av didn't touch the food, it just went into the airspace of the keli. So the keli is a rishon, the food is a sheni, that's called tamei. Here the pasuk says in Tzav that if kachim touches a sheni, it may not be eaten. That's befedish that kachim can become a shlishi. The kamar Rachmana lo yeyachel. So since we already know shlishi befedish, so now we don't say dayoy. Now Revi will be learned mikal v'chomer. Hadamrin on the Kal V'chomer that we mentioned above, that we find through the din of Mechusei Kippurim, that a Mechusei Kippurim can eat Truma. A Mechusei Kippurim cannot eat Kachim. Kachim is more Chamer than Truma, so we take it one notch even farther. Even a Revi invalidates the Kachim. Okay, moving on now to the rule number 9. Now this will be the most exciting rule that we will learn about today. So the Mishnah said like this. Now let's go back, Chevra. A person biblically cannot become a Sheni. The Chachamim not only added the concept of a tumah of a sheni to a person and to a keli, but let's focus now on a person. They said that in many times, only part of the person is tamei on the level of a sheni, and that is the person's hands. Number one, if I touch a rishon, my hand becomes a sheni, not my body. If I touch the inside of scripture, my hand becomes a sheni. And then we said, if I had Hesach Hadas, I don't want to focus on Hesach Hadas, because a person normally has Hesach Hadas on both of their hands. Let's focus on the first case, if I touch the Rishon. Now, if I touch the Rishon with my right hand, I'm going to call hand number 1 and hand number 2. Hand number 1 means the hand that had direct contact with Rishon. Hand number 1 that touched Rishon, that hand becomes tamei on the level of a Sheni Midrabanan. What happens to the other hand? Hand number 2. Hand number 2 does not become tamei. Now the Mishnah says that by kachim, both hands become tamei. What we're going to figure out as we unpackage the Gemara, the Mishnah doesn't mean to say that both hands right away become tamei. What does the Mishnah mean? We'll find out in a moment. So let's begin reading. So it says, the Gemara is quoting the Mishnah that Ubetruma, Im nitmeis, if one hand becomes tamei, only that one hand is tamei, and by kachim, it extends to the other hand. So let's start with the first machlokes amoraim. Amar Rav Shizvi. He's saying that the only time we say that both hands become tamei, and therefore the food, the kachim that it touches becomes tamei, is bichiburen shanu. Guys, hand number one, hand number two. Hand number one is the hand that's tamei, sheni. If hand number two is bichiburen, hand number two is right now touching hand number one. And at the same time that it's touching hand number one, at the same time that it's joined with hand number one, hand number two touches kachim. So let's say if it's this hand is sheni, this hand was nothing. If when hand number two is touching, chibura means right now it's touching hand number one, and hand number two is touching kachim at the same time, that is where the Mishnah says that the chomer of kodesh is that the kachim becomes tamei. And by the way, bichiburin, why? If it has to be touching at the same time, l'choura, like Rashi says, it's because we are afraid that since hand number two, which is touching kachim now, is now touching hand number one, it could be that hand number one directly touched the kachim. That is the fear, because they're so joined, they're together. And that would mean that what, my friends, that the kachim would become impure on what level? If it's a chashash that the kachim is touching a hand that's a sheni, that would mean the kachim is midrabanan, a shlishi. What do we call a shlishi? Tamei, because that kachim now has enough tuma that it can impart it even to another piece of kachim. That's very important. The other option would say that hand number two is only a shlishi. If hand number two would be viewed only as a shlishi, then if hand number two touches kachim and nidarabanan and makes it tamei, it only makes it puzzle. It makes that already only a revi. But Rav Shizvi, who is saying that our Mishnah's chumrah is only if hand number two is at the same time touching hand number one and touching the kachim, that's the only time that we're machmir and we say the kachim becomes tamei. That would also mean that the kachim becomes a shlishi. Okay. Avol shaloi bichiburan. If hand number two touched hand number one, and now it's not touching it anymore, and now hand number two touches kachim, it doesn't become tamei at all. That's a big limitation to the din in the Mishnah. And as we'll see, Abaya completely disagrees with Rav Shizvi, as we will have in the continuation of the sugya. Abaya challenges Rav Shizvi from the following brayso. It says in a brayso, Yod Neguva, a hand that's dry. We will see in a moment why that's in Chiddush, why we're speaking about a hand that's dry. Or let me just give you one piece of information to review. That whenever liquids have contact, even only with the sheni, midrabanan, they become a rishon. But hands that are dry, so there is no such a possibility. Nevertheless, metame chaverta, one hand does make another hand tamei. Letamei la kodesh, oy gewalt. That means if hand number one became the sheni, then hand number one touched hand number two. Hand number two becomes tamei on what level? On the level of a sheni. Even though it's not touching it anymore. How do I know that? Letamei la kodesh, because if hand number two now touches kachim, what are we calling that kachim? Tamei. We're not calling that kachim puzzle. Which means, mamash min hakatze la katze. Hand number one is sheni. If it touches hand number two becomes tamei, whether it's touching it whether it's continuously touching it or not. Doesn't have to be joined together. How tamei? Like hand number one. Which means that now, if it touches kachim, it's metamei the kachim. The food, if the kachim is shlishi, not poisel. Tamei, hand number two is a sheni. Midarabanan, that's the chumrah. So says Tzatana. Avoloi letruma. But again, we don't say that for truma at all. It's hand number two doesn't become tamei at all if it touches truma. Even though we're saying hand number two is like sheni, Sheni can make Shlishi puzzle, it won't make the Truma puzzle. Because don't forget, hand number 2 never became really tummy. Hand number 1 touched the Rishon. The fact that they touched each other, that Chumrah is only concerning Kachim, so says Rabbi. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, again, no one will agree apparently with Rav Shizvei, but he goes down a notch. He says that when hand number 1, the one that became a Sheni, touches hand number 2 becomes a Shlishi. And it remains a Shlishi. It doesn't have to be B'chiburim. It was contact, Shlishi. Meaning, if it touches Kachim, it makes the Kachim puzzle. It makes the Kachim a Revi. He says, Lifsoil, Avaloy Latame. So it's amazing. So you have a Braisa that has a Machlokes regarding a detail, L'chu'ura, of our Mishnah's 9th Chomer, only debating what level does hand number 2 receive. Does it become a Sheni? Does it become a Shlishi? Now, I Amrad Bishloima, that our Mishnah is speaking even, Shaloi B'chiburin. Listen to this detail. Hainu de Ravusei Dina Guva. We're going to focus on why did Rebbe have to begin speaking even on a hand that's dry. That's important. Like we mentioned, because when the hand is wet, if the hand is wet, what are we concerned? What is the status of the moisture, my friends? The status midrabanan of liquid is that if liquid touches something that's a sheni, it goes back to be a rishon. Now, if the liquid is a rishon and rishon touches the second hand, what does the second hand become? A sheni, which is really what the Rebbe is saying, but there's no chiddush to that, because that said, by the way, that said even regarding truma. That's the rule, that if a rishon touches a hand, midrabanan, the hand becomes a sheni. We never say a double derabanan. It is a double derabanan. It doesn't bother me that it's a double derabanan. But the fact that liquids themselves became a rishon is a derabanan. Tumas yadayim to begin with is a derabanan. But here we would say that. Now we understand why he says even the guva. Avo eli yomrad b'chiburin in shloi b'chiburin loi. Ma'irav usid in a guva. There's no need to say neguva. In other words, if the whole din that hand number 2 is able to impart tuma by kachim, it's only when it's touching hand number 1, then of course, and why does it have to be touching is basically the way that we explained of Shizvi correctly, not because hand number 2 becomes tummy. It doesn't. It doesn't become tummy. If hand number 2 is touching hand number 1 and at the same time it's touching kachim, we are afraid maybe the kachim directly touched hand number 1. Hand number 1 is a sheni. Of course the kachim becomes tummy and not puzzle. Has nothing to do with wet or not wet. Is that the very fact that he's emphasizing whether it's wet and even if it's dry, is that it's not about we are afraid that hand number 1 is going to touch the kachim. We don't say this chumrah only b'chiburin. No, the whole din is that hand number 1 has the koyach midrabanan to be metamei hand number 2, and the machlokes between these two tanoim is on what level. According to Rebbe, it becomes a sheni. According to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, it becomes a shlishi. And because of that, Abaya completely disagrees with Rav Shizvi. And now the Gemara continues that itmanami, and the itmanami is this machlokes, or this way machlokes, which has to do how to understand the Mishnah, will be also connected to another machlokes between a Shlakish and Abi Yechanan, and ultimately we will see that they all came to the same opinion, and from there again you will see that our Mishnah's rule number 9 is not b'chiburin. It's not because we say that hand number 1 cannot be metama hand number 2, but if it's touching hand number 1 and touching kachim, maybe the hand 1 touched the kachim. Not because of that. That our Mishnah's chumrah is that even though the hand is only tamei, sheni midrabanan. For kachim, if my hand touches my other hand, we'll see whether another person's other hand, it imparts tuma. Again, there's a machlokes, how far down? Does it become a sheni, or does it only become a shlish? Let's read inside. So, itmanami, amarei shlakish. Loi shanu, the din of our Mishnah, the 9th rule, ella yadoi. This chumrah, that hand which is a sheni, which touches another hand, is only if it touches it from the same person. Again, I'm saying right and left. It can be left and right. Just hand 1 is the one that became tamei sheni, and hand 2 is the one that touched hand number 1. then taka we're machmir. However you'll understand it, daf chav daled amid base. Avol yad chaveiroi. But if hand number one, that's a sheni, touched another person's hand, even for the dinim of kachim, loi, that person b'chlal did not become tamei. On no level, not a sheni, not a shlishi, they can touch kach. Rabbi Yechanan Amar, Rabbi Yechanan disagrees. And Rabbi Yechanan is going to tell me 3 dinim. Rule number 1, yes.
What's the significance of the vav for Zerav? Isn't it usually Rabbi Yochanan? If it's a continuation, isn't it usually Sam Rabbi Yochanan Amar?
I think that they did not have this debate together. And as we'll see in a moment, take a very good observation, that the Reish Lakish at some point agreed with Rabbi Yechanan. I don't think they were debating. They were learning in separate places and they were understanding the Mishnah differently and they came to the same conclusion at the end. So, Rabbi Yechanan Amar, no, rule number 1. Like he said 3 dinim. He wasn't talking to Reish Lakish. Din number 1 is echad yodei ve'echad yad chaveri. The rule of our Mishnah is, again, likachim, hand number 1 has the power to impart some level of tumah to hand number 2. Rule number 2, uba oisa hayad. Look inside the Rashi, top line, uba oisa hayad. That im naga biyad harishoyne biyad chaveroi, aval hashniya eine metama yad chaveroi. In other words, the hand that has the power to impart tumah to another hand, whether it's yours, whether it's someone else's, it can only impart it because it touched the original hand that was tamei. But the hand, mine or yours, whichever hand that received tumah from a hand, can never impart tumah yet to another hand. That's very important. And din number 3, that's a third din, lifsoil avoloi latame. That's very important. Even the hand number 2 that became tamei, on what level does it become tamei? This is really connected to the machlokes and the brayso that we learned above, and this is going to follow our understanding, which is the meaning of Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. That hand number 2 only becomes a shlishi, which therefore, if it touches kachim, it only makes it pasul, which means it makes it a revi. Avoloi latame, hand number 2 is not tamei on the same level of hand number 1. And these are the 3 dinim. Now, the Gemara wants to know, where did Rabbi Yechanan get the first of the 3, which is in disagreement with Reish Lakish, which is that no matter what hand it touched, it will impart, I know, only shlishi, but it's going to make the other hand a shlishi. Mimai, says the Gemara, 3 lines from the top, midiktani seifa, that since it says in the seifa of our Mishnah, and the Mishnah daf chaf amid beis, and I want to go back and read it, and you'll see that when you read the Mishnah, it sounds like the Mishnah is saying words that are extra. The Mishnah begins with rule number 9. I'm reading inside the Mishnah that ubatruma im nitmes achas miyadav chaverta tohira. Uba kodesh madbil shteim. Enough. Clear. In other words, if there's contact between one hand and the other for truma, the other hand is tahir. And by kodesh, if there's contact, you gotta take off the tuma. And again, the detail, how do you take off tumas yodayim lekachim, not through netila but through tvila. Then when the Mishnah adds 3 lines in the bottom on daf chaf amid beis, shahayad metames chaverta b'kodesh avalei b'trumat, mamish sounds like a repetition. Back inside our Gemara, daf chaf daled amid beis, 3 lines from the top of the amid, because since it says in the sefer shahayad metama chaverta l'kodesh avalei l'truma, this entire clause was superfluous, apparently. Hasulamali, hatanalasha. Elalav shmamino, that's the point. That if the Mishnah wants to emphasize that this rabbinic chumrah, that the hand that touched tumah, the hand that became a sheni, can impart tumah, when it touches another hand, it's anyone's hand. Lasui yat chaveroi. Now, says the Gemara, I want you to know that ultimately Reish Lakish retracted his original opinion. Now, the machlokes that we quoted was only regarding din number 1. Is it only yadoi or also yad chaveroi? But now we're going to quote what Reish Lakish said regarding all the 3 dinim, and they are all like Rabbi Yechanan. Reish Lakish hadabei, the Amar Rav Yoina, Amar Rav Ami, Amar Reish Lakish. Rule number 1, din number 1. this chumra lekachim is echad yodoi ve'echad yad chaveroi. Rule number 2, like we explained, only ba'oisa hayad. Only happens once. It doesn't go on in forever. My hand touched your hand and your hand touched. Oh no, it doesn't go. It's just the hand that touched the rishon. And number 3, again, like we learned above, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, that even hand number 2 is not tamei on the level of a sheni. The way he is wording it is that if hand number 2 touches kachim, it only makes the kachim puzzle. Says the Gemara now, this din of lifsal avaloy latame is really tanoyihi. Now, guys, we already learned the Braisa on Amud Aleph, and the Gemara is going to bring it soon and correct. This is a machlokes between Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. But prior to quoting the Braisa, the Gemara is going to attempt to link it to a Mishnah, which will be even a greater, more known machlokes tanoim. The Tnan, this is a Mishnah in Yodayim, says in the Mishnah, kol hapoisel betruma, anything that has the power to make truma pasul, chavranu. What makes truma pasul? Only a sheni. Remember that. A rishon doesn't make truma pasul. A rishon makes truma tamei. So kol hapoisel truma, which means anything that's tamei on the level of a sheni. Metame yodayim lihiyois sheniyim. Wow. Metame yodayim lihiyois sheniyos. This is a din that it makes yodayim to become shniyos. Wow. Basically, it sounds like that for kodesh, that if my hand touches your hand, what does my hand become? Shniyos, a sheni, not a shlishi. Right? This sounds like Rebbe. Number 2, v'yad mitame chavertoi. Now, the havamina of this, the yad matama chaverti divi Rabbi Yeshua, that it goes on forever. That my hand becomes a sheni, I touch your hand becomes a sheni, all a kodesh. And you know, it's the tuma of sheni from hand to hand to hand stays. These are the words of Rabbi Yeshua. No, that since yodayim to begin with are sheniyos, the ein sheni oisa sheni. Take out the word chulin, because we're only speaking about kachim. In other words, l'chayda, what is the Chachamim saying? That the second hand becomes a shlishi. So this is that the at the end, at Rabbi Yochanan to begin with. Reish Lakish never spoke about this in the beginning, but Reish Lakish, that they both are saying that the second hand becomes a shlishi. The Gemara is saying l'chayda, that's only the Chachamim, because according to Rabbi Yeshua, it sounds like he's saying that a hand makes another hand a sheni. So, and my love, that sheni hu delay of it, when the Chachamim say sheni, but hashlishi of it. So that is the machlokes. Says the Gemara, no. You understand Rabbi Yeshua correct. Rabbi Yeshua is very machmir. But you don't understand the Chachamim, because maybe the Chachamim are saying not only does a hand not have the koyach to make another hand a sheni, maybe the Chachamim hold that a hand cannot even make another hand a shlishi, which would mean that the Chachamim in the Mishnah in Yodayim argues with our Mishnah. If you remember, we spoke about the 11 milas. In the beginning of the Spedic, those who understand, I think it was Rabbi Ila, who understands that the first one and the fifth one is both connected to a chatzitza, we can put them together. Which is why, remember, we learned 10 milas, even though we counted 11. It's 10 because if they're both connected to chatzitza, then they're 10. Now we're seeing another way of understanding that there are others who held that there aren't 11. There's only 10 because they completely removed number 9. So now if you're looking for a Tana that will be the base of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, now you really have to find it. Because now Rabbi Yeshua is saying that as far as kachim is concerned, one hand that touches another hand makes the hand number 2 into a sheni. So now it's almost like, if that's not the pshat and the chachamim, let's find a more explicit source where Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish have whom to lean on. So the Gemara says, and we've just learned this on Amud Aleph, Elokei HaTanoim, and it is a machlokes tanoim, clearly, And this is the source, not a Mishnah, but here a Braisa, the Tanya, as we learned above, that Yad Meguva, Metamas Chaverta Latama Bakoidish, Avaloy Latruma Divrei Rebbe. All right, Latame Bakoidish. Here again means that hand number 2 becomes a Sheni, but again, not like Rav Shivzi. Here, we already clarified that. It means that one hand that touches another hand, for a moment, it imparts Tuma. As far as Kachim is concerned, hand number 2 becomes a Sheni. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Oisa Hayad, and only Lifsol Avaloy Latame. Gavaldik. And that's the Itmanami. So Itmanami ultimately Rav Shizvi is basically rejected. It's not limited to Chiburin, but the second hand becomes only Tama on a level of a Sheni, so Paskin, both Rabbi Yechanan and Eish Lakish. Now we're moving on to the Chomer number 10. It said in the Mishnah that Oichlin, Oicholin, Neguvim, Biyodayim, Mesoyabis, that you can eat foods, even Truma. Even though your hands are Tamei, you can eat Truma if the food is dry. Why is that? Because, like we mentioned, food that never got wetted after it was harvested or after it was gathered, after it was disconnected from the ground, is not even susceptible to becoming Tamei. Even though Truma could become a Shlishi, Yodayim, Stam Yodayim, or Yodayim that you know are a Sheni can make Truma Tamei, but if it's dry, it cannot become Tamei, and Lakoidish, by Kachim, it could become Tamei. So many people, when they learn the Mishnah, they understand, I understand the Mishnah. This is connected to the broader concept that the idea, the rule, that some food item has to first become wet for it to become mukhshar, like kabel tuma, is not shaykh by kachim. It's not relevant, and it's not relevant to kachim. And why? These are the words of Chazal. It's called chibas hakodesh machsharton. Simply by the fact that it's kachim, the love that we have for kachim, the reverence that we have from kachim, it makes it already mukhshar. Our Gemara says, since we already know the rule of Chibas HaKodesh Machsharton, it must be that our Mishnah is telling you a din that goes beyond that. Let's read it inside. There's no such a concept as dry or wetted as far as Kachim is concerned. Chibas HaKodesh Machsharton. Or you can formulate this in a question. So all Kachim is as if it got wet. So it's like apples and oranges. So what? It's not that there's a chomer from kachim over truma. It's that by kachim everything is already considered wetted. Our Mishnah is going beyond. Our Mishnah is saying something else. So the case of our Mishnah is kigoin. No, it's that my hands cannot touch kachim even though they were never wet. Of course, we know that. But the Mishnah is saying something even more. If kodesh was put into my mouth without me touching it at all, or if I used a fork, really it means a toothpick or a stick, I got food of kachim inside my mouth without making it tamei, even though my hands are shniyos. Now I know that, guys, if I touch a toothpick or a stick, a flat woodenware never becomes tamei. But the point is, if I have kachim in my mouth, my hands are a sheni, and now I want to eat chulin, and I want to put it in my mouth. I want to put a radish in my mouth, or a batzel, or an onion in my mouth of chulin, to eat it at the same time that I'm eating my kachim. Am I allowed to do it? So here is where we say gazru buhu rabbanon. That la kodesh gazru rabbanon. La truma loy gazru rabbanon. That is the case of the Mishnah. Let's read inside the Rashi, like a middle of the Amid, around 21 lines from the top of the Amid. Now, first of all, the emphasis is that these side foods are chulin, and therefore they cannot become tamei. She'ein yodayim mitamei says, even though my hands are a sheni, me picking up the onion will not make the onion tamei. Nevertheless, afilo hachi gazur rabbanan shelo yoichlem im hakodesh. I should not put that food in my mouth when there is kachim food in my mouth. Why? Pentiga yodoi misoy eves ba'oichle kodesh befiv. Because if I'm putting food in my mouth, maybe my hand then at that moment will touch the kachim that's already in my mouth. When it comes to eating truma, we say that if a person did not wash their hands, they will be very careful not to touch the truma. They will be very careful not to touch the truma. Now, why are we speaking about dried out foods? I want to scoot down a little bit on Nashi. That Olohachi noktat niguvim. She'ilu achshav hayamashkin alein. If the foods that I were eating, like you could ask, what's the neguvim by truma? If a person is careful and they won't touch the foods, then even if the hands are wet, truma's already in my mouth. Let me pick up the bottle when it's wet and put it in my mouth. You can't say that. Because again, liquids, midrabanan. If my hands are shniyas and it touches liquids, chulin liquids, the chulin liquid becomes a rishon. So if the bottle is wet, if the radish is wet, I have truma in my mouth, and I'll be careful. I will never touch with my hands the truma in my mouth. But if I touch the wet bottle, the liquid on the onion becomes a rishon, which means the onion becomes a sheni. The bottle in my mouth will make the truma into a shlishi. So the only issue is whether I will accidentally with my hands touch the truma that's already in my mouth. That is where we say the person will be careful. The Chachamim made no such a decree for truma, but for kachim they were afraid that accidentally when you're putting another food in your mouth, you might touch the kachim. That is the detailed case of our Mishnah. That b'chlal, that if I touch kachim, even though it never became wet, that it's makabel tuma, but that's not included in the 11 or in the 10 of the Mishnah. Let's go back inside our Gemara. We are now up to the final, we are now up to the 11th. Zok the Gemara, what's the 11th? The 11th Maila of our Mishnah was a person who was an oinen, and like we spoke out to Rashi, normally a person has a mitzvah to occupy him or herself with the burial of their relatives. So normally an oinen becomes tamei b'tumas meis. We're not talking about that. Our Mishnah is speaking about someone who's not tamei. They were far away. They were unable to be part of the burial. Nevertheless, an oinen may not eat kachim. Now the period of aninus ended. Similarly, a person was a mechusar kippurim, and they brought their karbanos. They're good to go. For kachim, you got to go to the mikvah again. Says the Gemara, ha'oinen mechusar kippurim, my tameh. Because since kiven the ad ho'idna lo yasirei havasirei, since prior to them going out of their state of aninus, prior to them bringing their korbanos, they were not allowed to eat kachim. Therefore, now guys, one important nuance. What were they allowed to eat? They were allowed to eat truma, which is very interesting. Very interesting, because just to recap and to appreciate this last line, we went through the 5 steps, at least according to some machloikas tanoim. Remember, Rabbanan have made the 5 steps is chulin, ma'aser sheni, truma, kachim, mechatos. Do you know that an oinen cannot eat ma'aser sheni? That's an explicit pasuk in Parshas Kisavai. If an oinen also would not be allowed to eat truma, then the whole sugya was, why didn't they make it by truma? Then they would have made the same takana by truma. But for some reason, even though an oinen cannot eat ma'aser sheni, an oinen can eat truma if you're a kohen. So since the state of aninus was not stopping you from eating truma, a mechusar kippurim, second time today, after there's head of shemesh, even though he has to bring karbanos tomorrow, is allowed to eat truma, there's no reason why the chachamim should decree you have to go to the mikvah. Because your state, prior to leaving it, never prevented you of eating truma to begin with. But since for kachim, kiven the ada in the havayasirei, even though the cause went away, atzrichinu rabbanan, rabbinically, to go to the mikvah prior to you eating any part of kachim. And with this, we concluded the 10 or 11. Our Mishnah has 11 milas, and God willing, tomorrow we're going to go further into many other dinim of Tumen Tara, beginning with dinim of Truma.